back to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. You know, I want to make sure to say this part clearly as we go forward each and every week. It's important to understand that we are the ones who get something extraordinary out of this relationship. You know, God is waiting there for us, and He's done all of the heavy lifting. He was the one who has endured with us through all of this pain and misery and suffering, and He is the one who carried all of our sin debt to the cross to tear down that barrier, that wall that was between us and Him. He's opened up the door to eternity. But it's not because He's missing something. He wants that relationship with us, but we're the ones who's missing something. And I like to think of it from this perspective. You know, when we step out into the sunshine, you have that moment where you step into the sunshine and you're just met by that warm glow of the sun, and it just warms your body for a while. And if you're not standing in Florida or someplace like that where the humidity's 900%, it's wonderful and it feels great. And you get that moment where the sun just warms you up. In heaven, God actually shines like the sun. It says there's no need for a sun in heaven because God in all of His glory lights up the universe. And I think the part that you can easily miss sometimes is what's missing on this side of eternity. You know, there's so many complaints that everybody brings up about God. God allows this and God allows that. And how could a loving God allow all of these things? Sometimes we miss the things that we're missing the most. Knowing that we're loved, feeling lonely, knowing that, just not knowing that we belong, all of those questions and anxieties and fears that are all around us all the time. Instead of stepping into the sunlight and feeling the warmth of the sun shining on your skin, I want you to imagine stepping into eternity and feeling the warm glow of God's love covering you and feeling that love soak into you like warm sunshine. You'll never again wonder if you're loved. You'll never again feel lonely. You'll never again wonder where you belong. That hole that's in our heart, that piece of us that knows that we're missing something, that is the Holy Spirit calling us back to God. And when we look at that, and when we reach eternity, when we reach that point, it'll be an eternity of love and belonging like you can't possibly imagine. So when I say the most important truth in the entire universe is God's love, is that God loves you, it's hard to imagine what that means and what an eternity of being in God's presence will be like. Something to consider as we go forward. Now, in this week's episode, we're going to finally wrap up and answer the question, what is the most likely answer for where the universe came from? And we've been looking at three possibilities. I think it's important to address this question because I know there are going to be people who say, what can a bean counter possibly know about these important scientific issues? How dare you question Richard Dawkins, or how dare you question Stephen Hawking? How can you possibly throw your opinion out there? And I think the reality is sometimes it's better to be a normal, common person coming into this debate because I'm not carrying some of the baggage that I think is out there. I love this quote, and I wanted to maybe address this through this quote from a scientist. He was an astrophysicist and agnostic, actually, whose name was Robert Jastrow. He wrote a book in 1978 called God and the Astronomers. And I love this quote, and I think it sums up a little bit of what we're facing out there. As he was looking at this question of all of the evidence piling up, pointing to the singularity and pointing to a beginning point of the universe and all of the issues that brings up, he put it this way: for the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. And I think sometimes it seems like that's the fear that's out there. You know, the Bible begins with the phrase, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." What if that was true? What if that actually encapsulates the beginning point of the universe, and that is the singularity that we're talking about? It's a little bit scary for some people. And it's part of the reason I've tried to focus on who is God. We began this journey with looking at who is God and wrapping some context around it, because at the end of the journey, if in fact what we do find is a creator waiting there for us, Wouldn't it be amazing if it was a creator who loved us so much he gave everything for us? Just again, food for thought as we go forward. But as we look at this, I want to address these issues, and I think it's important that we don't take anything off the table. You know, one of the things I've tried to illustrate in the weeks coming up to this is that you have people like Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking and others who have tried to rule God out of bounds, who've tried to say, well, we're not going to allow God into this discussion. You can't do that. In any sense, you cannot remove from the journey. You cannot take off the table one of the legitimate possible answers. And don't take that to mean that in all of this, every answer is possible, every answer is a good answer, and therefore we have to consider every single thing. You know, I have done some teaching in my life over the years, and I will tell you something that all teachers know. There is such a thing as a bad question. There are things that are dumb questions that we shouldn't ask. And as a teacher, you recognize sometimes questions that if you attempt to answer them are going to completely derail the class, and you learn to maneuver around those when you're teaching a class to actually reach the end of your subject by the end of the period. There are subjects and things that are ridiculous, and obviously we shouldn't consider them. But God cannot be removed from this equation, because as an atheist cannot disprove God's existence. And while it is equally wrong to go into this discussion and say, every time we don't know what happens, I'm going to simply insert God into the equation. We're not ever going to do that. But it's equally wrong to look at this and say, the first thing I'm going to do is take God out of the equation, and we will choose from the answers that are left. Because as we're going to see today, that's not going to get us to the truth. And I think we need to address that at every point in this process going forward so that we reach the best answer as we do this. Okay, so we've been looking at 3 distinct possibilities of where the universe came from. And we're going to take those in reverse order today. So the first possibility that we're going to look at today is the universe past eternal? Has it existed for forever? Now, last week we wrapped up our conclusion on that using scientific information. Again, we're not using theology, but we looked at that and we recognized for 5 different reasons that cannot be the case. The first was the logical impossibilities of true infinites existing in the real world outside of mathematics. Number 2 was Einstein's general theory of relativity and the conclusion that it leads us to in an expanding universe, that when we hit the rewind button, the universe collapsed back into a singularity. Number 3 was the background radiation that we find, the evidence that still remains out there left over from the Big Bang as proof of the Big Bang as an event that occurred. Number 4 was the second law of thermodynamics that asked the question, well, if the universe has been around past eternal, then why hasn't it grown cold and died over time? The universe would have grown cold long ago. All of the stars would have run out of gas, and the universe would have run out of available energy, and it would have reached a point of heat death millennia ago. Why are we still here to ask that question if the universe is past eternal? And then number 5 was the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, which again, this one is related to Einstein's special theory of relativity, not his general theory of relativity. But the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem basically concludes that any expanding universe could not have existed past eternal. And as we looked at those 5 items, we reached a conclusion that is a logical, reasonable conclusion, that the standard model is correct, that there was in fact a beginning point, there was a singularity, that beginning point in time, space, matter, energy, everything, where the universe leapt into existence. The universe could not have existed past eternal. So option number 1, that the universe has existed past eternal, cannot be accurate. Science tells us that cannot be the case. That leads us to option number 2. Option number 2 would be that the universe leapt into existence out of nothing. The old adage that out of nothing, nothing comes is wrong. And what actually happened was out of nothing, everything came. But while the scientific theories wrapped around this are terribly interesting, and while there are a great many of them, the only way you're going to get something from nothing is if you've changed the definition of nothing. Nothing, remember, means not anything. And as long as we stick to a true definition of nothing as being not anything, and we don't try to sneak quantum vacuums or black holes or something else over beyond the singularity. In other words, as long as we don't try to sneak something into nothing to explain the something that we were trying to explain in the first place, then you can't get everything from nothing. You can't get anything from nothing. You cannot, there's no logical, scientific, or any other reason to believe that everything came from nothing. The only way you get there is if you very cleverly change the definition of nothing. And once you do that, well, then you've changed the rules. I hate to say cheated, but I don't know how else to describe it. If you've snuck something into nothing and then said you explained nothing, well, you haven't explained anything. You've just snuck something over there and said, oh, look what just happened. In any other world, that would be cheating. And I have a hard time not saying that here. So there's no grounds to believe that something could have come from nothing. We're not going to quite close the door completely on that. I'm going to leave it open for just a moment. And I want to jump now back and talk about the last possible item, that the universe was created by an intelligent outside agent. Now, when we talked about the fact that the universe could not have existed past eternal, what we've established in looking at that is that the universe began to exist. The universe hasn't always existed. The universe began to exist. And I want to go back to something that we looked at a few episodes ago called the Kalam cosmological argument. Remember the two premises that led to our conclusion. Anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. The logic is very straightforward. The reasoning behind it is sound. The universe began to exist. We know that. The universe could not have existed past eternal. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Could the universe be its own cause? No, nothing can be its own cause. Something has to be the cause of something else. The universe cannot explain its own existence. So when we look at that, we're looking for an outside candidate that would explain the creation of the universe. Now, what do we know as we look at that? We know a couple of different things. Number one, time, space, matter, energy, everything came into existence at that one moment, the Big Bang, as we all call it. So we're looking for a cause that has to be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and enormously powerful. Okay? If all of those things came into existence at the moment of the Big Bang, then whatever created the universe has to be those things. Now, if it has to be timeless, well, that entity had to have existed outside of space and time. It has to be enormously powerful. It has to, again, spaceless, so existed outside of space. And it would have to be enormously intelligent and not made up of matter. It would have to be immaterial. So we're talking about, potentially, what possible type of entity could explain that? A spiritual being could explain that. A spiritual being that exists outside of space and time. A spiritual being of enormous intelligence who is also enormously powerful. There is a candidate that quickly jumps to mind when you think about it in those terms. Intelligence is going to be the key that I want to focus on, because I don't want this to become speculation. We're going to turn after we look at this episode today, and the next thing we're going to start looking at is the universe that we've gotten. Because the universe that we have is anything but random. And we're going to address the anthropic principle in the episodes coming up to address this issue of, well, the universe we've got is just the universe that we've got, and how lucky were we? We're going to talk about how much luck it would take, and we're going to begin that conversation today. But when we look at this, it's the overriding fingerprint of intelligence that begins to show itself at every step of this journey. Intelligence leaves behind fingerprints. And what we start to see is a universe that began with enormous precision. And we're going to recognize this in the next steps to come. But when we start looking back and we look for, is there a candidate that explains this? We're not only explaining the existence of the universe, but now we're going to take that next step into, well, what kind of universe are we explaining? And what we're going to see is the universe that we're explaining is incredibly fine-tuned. It's well-designed, like we can't even begin to fathom. So how do we move forward? Looking at the facts that we have, logic and reason tells us there are only three possibilities for how the universe came into existence. The most logical answer, even though we don't want to go down this path, some of us don't want to go down this path, the most logical answer has to be that the universe was created by an outside entity. A third party is the only answer that makes sense. It doesn't make scientific or logical sense that the universe created itself. That door is honestly closed to us as long as we hold to a strict definition of nothing at the beginning of the universe. The universe could not have existed past eternal based on the scientific evidence that's available to us, the most current scientific evidence. So what do? Do we just say, well, there you go, God did it and that's all there is, and we're just going to close the books on it and move forward? Many of you, I suspect, are not convinced by that. And that's okay. It's the next steps. It's every step in the process. It's the cumulative weight of the journey that begins to clarify for us that the universe was created by an intelligent third party. This is the first step. And we have to make a decision. And the logical decision in this is to recognize that the universe was in fact created by an outside third party. Now, you may look at it and say, well, it's an outside third something and we don't know what it was. Okay, fine. But the fingerprint of intelligence is going to begin to clear that up for us tremendously as we move forward. The fingerprint of intelligence, remember, is the difference between a God of the gaps theory and recognizing, well, no, wait a minute, I may not be able to see who did it, but I recognize someone intelligent actually did that. You know, if I was to suddenly show up on Mars tomorrow, and I was to find a mountain, and into the mountain were carved the four faces of the four presidents from Mount Rushmore, my first reaction to that wouldn't be, wind and time and erosion caused all of that. That's fascinating. Now, I wasn't there to see who carved it, but I could easily recognize that if I found an exact duplicate of Mount Rushmore on the planet Mars, I would correctly conclude someone did that. The fingerprint of design and intelligence would be quite clear in that case. Same would be true if I went to go see Mount Rushmore here today. So the fingerprint of design is going to be more and more important as we go forward. And I'm not going to ask you just to say, and I'm not going to ask you just to take it for granted. But at the same time, I think both sides need to give a little something here. I'm willing to move on to the next step and say, okay, we're not going to say the journey's over. We're not going to conclude that God just did this. But I'm also not going to let this go for free. And I think the important thing to come back to here is mathematics. Because I think mathematics, again, is the ultimate scorekeeper in all of this as we move forward. So how do we settle this? Let me propose a few steps along the way that I think are going to help us in our journey. At every step along the way when we reach one of these points where the fingerprint of intelligence is clearly there, and if we are picking the most likely candidate, unless we simply rule God out from the beginning, an intelligent creator is the most logical example. If we don't rule that out from the beginning, that's where we honestly are at this moment. But to keep the journey going, I'm going to throw back on the table, let's say the universe jumped into existence all on its own. Let's say that just happened. It couldn't have existed past eternal, but let's say the standard model is somehow correct and the universe just created itself. I'm going to ask you for something if you fall into that camp of being a naturalist. If you're going to say the universe did this all on its own, I'm going to need an admission from you that that is remarkably unlikely. You know, we talked about this a couple of episodes ago. The most likely thing that could have popped, nothing could have popped into existence. It just defies scientific reason and logic if we stick to a definition of nothing. But let's say that something did. The most likely thing to pop into existence is going to be something ridiculously easy, like a subatomic particle, a proton maybe, or something that's very small, very simple. What's not going to be likely is that the entire universe pops into existence. That's ridiculously unlikely. So let's talk a little mathematics. And I think this will be helpful as we go forward. I want to establish some mathematical odds at each step along the way where we say, okay, to keep this going, we're going to have to loan out a little luck. We're going to be loaning luck out to the naturalist. And I want to illustrate a few of these points by talking about some numbers that we can appreciate before we start talking about numbers that are so outrageously large that none of us could ever grasp them. All right? Let's start with the lottery. Let's say the lottery is going to happen and I'm getting ready to go buy a lottery ticket. I think generally speaking, occasionally we all kind of do that, but the odds are so bad that none of us would actually live our lives by the lottery, right? The reason that that's the case is your odds are about 1 in 293 million of actually winning the lottery. And you go, well, there's 300 some odd million people in the United States, so if everybody bought a lottery ticket, I could be the one guy to win it. When you really think about that, those are terrible odds. I mean, the odds are every single human being in the United States could buy a lottery ticket, and nobody could win. That's also entirely possible. Because again, everybody has the same chances. It's not like everybody gets one set of numbers and eventually, well, there's all the numbers and you just pick from one of the numbers and somebody gets the right one. You could have everybody buy a lottery ticket and nobody gets the right set of numbers that happens to randomly be chosen. But your odds are right around 1 in 292 million. So let's make it easy, 1 in 300 million. Now to illustrate that, that's 3 times 10 to the 8th. And we're looking at the number of zeros that are going to be following the 10. That's what's important about this. So 3 times 10 to the 8th is what we're looking for. And you say, well, I mean, those are terrible odds, and I wouldn't live my life that way. But I mean, people do win the lottery. That does happen. I might be willing to risk, certain things with, maybe a coin toss. You toss a quarter, it's 50-50. Okay, well, I might be willing to, risk some things for a 50-50 coin toss. But if somebody looked at you and said, would you bet eternity? Would you bet your life on the toss of a quarter? We would say no. I mean, that's even 50-50, those are terrible odds. And that's 1 out of 2. We're talking about something so obscure, 1 out of almost 300 million, that's winning the lottery. But that's really good odds when we start talking about what's around us in the universe. Stephen Hawking addressed the expansion rate of the universe and how finely tuned the expansion rate of the universe was. And that's something close to 1 times 10 to the 17th. Now remember, the lottery was 10 to the 8th. The expansion rate of the universe, if it was changed ever so slightly from what it was, Hawking recognized that the universe would not have come into existence the way we see it, that it would have either just evaporated out into gas and nothing would have ever formed, or very little would have formed, or the universe would have collapsed back in on itself and formed a massive black hole. In either case, the odds are so remarkably slim that it's 1 times in 10 to the 17th power. Now you say, well, that's some pretty impressive odds right there. What would that actually look like? Interesting that you would ask that question. So if you look that up, and again, my math may be a little shaky on this, but it's going to be pretty close. If you look up 1 cubic foot of marbles contains 18,256 marbles. Thank you, I think Answers on yahoo.com for that. I'll put my reference up on the deal. So if you look at that, you've got about 18,256 marbles in a cubic foot of marbles. That's how many marbles it would take to fill up a cube. If you looked at the United States, there's 3,805,927 square miles in the United States. What would happen if you started pouring marbles all over the entire United States? You flattened out the country and you poured marbles all over every inch of this country. And you kept pouring and you kept pouring and you kept pouring, and you poured all of these blue marbles out all over the country. And you took 1 red marble and you hid it someplace. Let's say you hid it in your favorite spot, wherever that is. You hid 1 red marble and you covered the entire United States in about yay much marbles, about a half an inch or so thick full of marbles, maybe a little more than a half inch. And you blindfolded somebody and you dropped them off somewhere in the middle. Let's say you dropped them off in Kansas. That's about the middle. Nebraska might claim it's them, but it's really Kansas. So you drop somebody off in the middle of Kansas. You've covered the entire United States in about a half an inch full of marbles. And you told somebody, I need you, life or death, to go choose the 1 red marble in a sea of blue marbles. Those are the odds that we're talking about, that the expansion rate of the universe is exactly what it is, that we ended up with the universe that we've got. Now, you say that's a ridiculous idea. Nobody could actually do that. That's correct. And we're starting to get maybe in the ballpark of talking about how ridiculously rare the odds of some of these things would be. Let's go from there to something with odds that are even more dramatic. What about the exact setting of gravity in the universe? When you're looking at gravity, that's going to be 10 to the 39th power. Now, we were talking about, the expansion rate of the universe being covering the United States in marbles about a half an inch thick, something like that. What would it look like if you went from 10 to the 17th to 10 to the 39th power? You'd be talking about covering the United States in marbles 978 hundred trillion miles deep. That's not even what we're talking about here. What about the number of atoms in the universe? That's about 10 to the 80th power. What about something like, and some scientists use this term, and I know it makes people very angry on the internet, the universal probability bound of 10 to the 150th power. What that means very specifically, and we'll talk about that later when we talk about fine-tuning, is you reach a point where the numbers are so big that appealing to chance becomes ridiculous. And I think that's what we're talking about here to varying degrees. If you covered the United States in marbles half an inch deep, and you said, go find the one red marble in a sea of blue marbles, well, it's ridiculous. It could never happen. But that doesn't begin to get to how impossible what we're talking about is. We're talking about something that's impossible happening, and that would be for a proton to pop into existence. For the entire universe to pop into existence, it's to a degree of impossible that's impossible for us to imagine. But to allow the journey to move forward, let's assign something like the number of atoms in the known universe, 10 to the 80th power. And I think that's a reasonable number to attach to this. Let's assign a number to it so that we can begin to see what is the mathematical probability that naturalism holds out to be true. And we're going to keep score as we go forward to see how much luck do we have to loan to naturalism, to materialistic atheism in the course of this, to get us from nothing to where we are today. And that's what we're going to see as we go forward. I want to thank you so much for joining us today on this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. Next week, we're going to jump into the anthropic principle as we start to transition into the question of the design of the universe. And is the universe that we see around us, well, does it just explain itself, or is there a better explanation than that? As always, you can find us out on our YouTube homepage, on iTunes or Spotify. I hope if you enjoyed this week's podcast, you'll hit the like and subscribe button. We'd love to have you join us every single week. You can also find our podcasts out on our website at prooftograced.com, and you can reach out to us via email at prooftoggrace@yahoo.com. Thank you once again for joining us, and I hope someday you'll look for the greatest truth in the entire universe, God's enormous love for you. Thank you once again, and I hope you have a great week. Bye-bye.